One, two, three, four. Hello, everyone. I'm Dr.LLM.Christian Barrientos, and now with Martin Arostegui. He's especially military intelligence, meters, and our intelligence operation. He authored a book, Twilight Warriors. He worked around the world for the most important journals. Hey, Martin, how are you?
Hi, Christian. Just to fill in what you said, I'm the author of a book about special forces called Twilight Warriors, which came out with quite a bit of drew quite a few reviews when it came out a few years ago. And I've also, I worked around the world for most of the major newspapers of the world. Wall Street Journal, The Economist, done stuff for Fox News, CNN, the Washington Times, UPI, Times of London, Time Magazine, and specializing in the kind of conflicts that we have in Ukraine today, as you said. I've covered many wars and many conflicts, and the purpose of this podcast, or what I try to do with my Ukraine coverage of this podcast, is to give an overview of what is going on. I think a lot of people are confused. I think a lot of it's, as I say, it's difficult in a war when you have all kinds of news about all sorts of atrocities coming in all the time, all kinds of movements, both in military and diplomatic fronts, to tell the forest from the trees, to be able to see where we're headed, what is happening, and what then project where the situation is likely heading to. In fact, we saw Jamie Dimon the other day on a major interview of the chairman of the JP Morgan, saying that he couldn't predict which way the Ukraine war was going. So perhaps I can understand people who are hesitant to predict or project where a war is going. A war is one of the most fluid situations that nations or people can engage in. But I try to do that. And I hope that people like people like Jamie Dimon are listening to me, because I think what I have to say may enlighten them and may give them some compass, some idea of where it's all going.
That's the idea for this podcast.
That's the idea of this podcast, exactly. And of course, what we try to do is also report on the underside of the news, focus in, which I will do later, on a particular subject which perhaps has been ignored by the general media, but which we look into and draw important facts and trends, and try to assess its relevance in terms of international and global events. So let's start. First of all, I think it's important. Let's start by saying that it's now official. Russia fully occupies the city of Severodonetsk, something that we've touched on in previous podcasts. And its army is in complete control, a battle that we've been talking about now for quite some time. And its army is in complete control of Ukraine's eastern Luhansk province and practically all of the disputed Donbass region. They've also pretty much taken hold of Donetsk, the neighboring province, which Russia also is recognizing as an independent state, but annexed as a way of annexing into Russia. We'll get into that later. I said that the fall of Severodonetsk was happening 2 weeks ago. I said that at the time I had news that Ukrainians were already involved in a tactical withdrawal from Severodonetsk. It was not a rout. I think they were withdrawing the troops in an organized way, with the idea of mounting counterattacks in support of special forces units that remained entrenched in parts of the city, particularly some industrial complex there. But this has been they tried to support counterattacks against the Russians, but there was brutal house-to-house fighting, went on for several days. but it became impossible for Ukraine to sustain any resistance against constant, systematic, and increasingly well-targeted Russian artillery bombardments, which have largely leveled the city, similar to what Russia did in Mariupol over a month ago. This is clearly the tactic that Russia will rely on the siege of urban areas that will be increasingly difficult for Ukraine to defend in eastern parts of the country, where Russia counts with secure rear guard and supply lines. This stands in sharp contrast to their totally failed campaign to take Kyiv during the initial weeks of the invasion, where Russian frontline units became cut off from their supply bases, getting enveloped by Ukrainian special forces using guerrilla tactics to destroy highly exposed armor and supply convoys. While this was a remarkable victory, which spared Kyiv from the fate now being suffered by Ukraine's eastern cities, it may have generated a sense of false optimism about prospects of countering Russia in eastern Ukraine, where conditions are very different and the tactical situation is rather more favorable to Russia. A factor often overlooked by the media and the many analysts that comment on the Ukraine situation is that in Donbass, Russia counts with the support of local pro-Russian separatist forces organized as militias and armed volunteer forces by rebel governments that are formed in the provinces of Donetsk and Luhansk, whose independence Russia has recognized before the invasion and who are reliant on Russia for their, all of their military and economic support. The Donetsk People's Militia and the Luhansk People's Militia have been fighting Ukraine's armed forces since Russia occupied Crimea in 2014, when Moscow initiated a program of covert support for the separatist groups in Donetsk and Luhansk. While they were never strong enough to defeat the Ukrainians on their own, they are now providing critical support for the Russian army by securing its rear guard, securing its supply lines, and main logistical centers. They provide valuable local intelligence networks, allowing Russia to extend its political and police control, as well as highly motivated cadre for urban warfare. It's difficult to calculate at this point what portion of Russia's fighting strength is provided by these groups, possibly not very much in total numbers, as maybe they don't probably amount to more than a few thousand, maybe 10,000 at the most. But they're often melded with regular units, as well as Spetsnaz and Wagner group teams that direct some of their operations. But their role is vital to Russia's strategy of outflanking and encircling Ukraine forces in order to capture and hold ground in eastern Ukraine, consolidate control over the region. This is what Russia's doing, and it appears that until now, this part of the war, they are conducting it quite successfully. Following Severodonetsk, Russia's next target is Lysychansk, to where Ukrainian forces have retreated in an orderly fashion and are now entrenching themselves along higher ground and it lies across Zverodonetsk River from Severodonetsk along higher ground that gives the Ukrainians some tactical advantage. The area is already under heavy Russian bombardment, but its capture will require exposed river crossings in which Russian troops could sustain heavy casualties, adding to the massive volume of dead and wounded they have already suffered. There are no definitive figures yet, but Pentagon estimates put Russian losses at over 30,000, which is considerably more than Russia has lost in any war since World War II. In less than 5 months of fighting, Russia is approaching the same amount of men, the same number of men of losses that the US lost during its 10-year war in Vietnam. As we all know, and we all know how that went, right? How long Russia can take this is the unresolved question. After what is likely to be a bloody battle for Lysychansk, they will have to capture a series of other large-sized towns before fully opening the road to the city of Kramatorsk, which is eastern Ukraine's industrial heartland, containing important gas fields, which the Ukrainians can now fortify with the heavy artillery being received in growing quantities from the US and Britain. I think we already got a taste of what's to come when Russia bombarded a city in the Kramatorsk area, a shopping center, with a salvo of 40 cruise missiles that launched into that region. But the American long-range HIMARS multiple rocket launchers starting to arrive to give the Ukrainian army standoff capability. It's lacked until now, can to some extent perhaps counter this type of Russian barrage that they are likely now to use to terrorize and intimidate the civilian population of this central region in Donbass, okay? In eastern Ukraine, sorry, we're outside Donbass now. If Russia's advance on Kramatorsk can be effectively checked, it may be possible for Ukraine to force negotiations with a Moscow government unable to claim territorial gains beyond Donbass and the southern Black Sea corridor running to Crimea. But to think that any negotiated solution is possible without conceding territories in which Russia has established military dominance as well as political control is, quite frankly, unrealistic. And it is something that it'd be interesting to see what NATO has to say on this, or how they assess the situation when its member states meet in Madrid next week. News headlines last week announced that Ukraine has been officially admitted as a candidate for membership in the European Union. While hailed as a diplomatic victory for President Zelensky, this also means that the EU can more effectively pressure his government to strike a peace deal. It may even serve to get Zelensky off the hook with hardline factions in his government if he can defer to the EU whatever concessions he may be forced to make. Assuming that the Ukrainians are prepared to bear the cost and destruction of an interminable war with Russia, the Europeans whose economies are already starting to reel from the effects of vastly increased energy prices are not. A poll taken last week indicated that a plurality in most countries and a majority in some countries favor Ukrainian territorial concessions to Russia in order to end something panic, sort of a panic mode over Russia announced that it was cutting back on gas supplies to Europe. The tables are getting turned in the economic front. The gas supplies of Germany in particular, by the way, which has probably the largest amount of, relies on Russia for at least half its gas. The tables seem to be getting turned on the economic front. The threat is no longer that of Europe ending gas purchases from Russia, a rather fanciful idea pushed by officials of the Biden administration when the sanctions policy was initiated, but of Russia cutting off gas to Europe. This would mean gas rationing in Germany and other northern countries this coming winter, in which people might be unable to heat their homes, and many, particularly the elderly and most vulnerable, could easily and literally freeze to death. Right? This is the backdrop to NATO's much-awaited Madrid summit next week. It could turn into a divided summit if differences become apparent between hawkish members like the US, UK, and Poland, and some other East European states which want an aggressive policy to defeat Russia, and the more dovish and economically hard-pressed European governments like Germany, France, and Italy that favor a negotiated solution. Turkey may try to block NATO membership to Sweden and Finland over their support for Kurdish separatists, and also to possibly leverage a negotiated settlement for Ukraine. Turkey's capital, Ankara, has been proposed as a site for eventual peace talks, something that would grant Turkey its long-sought status of regional power broker. My guess would normally be that NATO succeeds in papering over its differences, as it generally has in the past. But with the manifestly weak political leadership currently exercised by Washington under the rather seemingly paralyzed and often divided administration of President Biden, it's possible that cracks in the alliance could become apparent in Madrid. We'll see what happens. If that occurs, if this does develop, this would be a major victory for Putin. His diplomatic strategy is focused on dividing NATO and channeling any eventual negotiations over Ukraine directly with the EU by exerting his economic leverage over the Europeans to marginalize Ukraine's main backers, military backers, the US and the UK. Under current trends, it's possible that he may just manage to achieve this.
Presidente France. Oh, sorry.
Let me finish by saying, Christian, the irony in all this, what's infuriating in all this, is that the US could exercise decisive leadership by moving to a more rational energy policy and boost fossil fuel production that would reduce oil and gas prices to deplete Russia's export revenues, while the US resumes its traditional role as an arsenal of democracy, or in this case, the gas station of democracy, and supply Europe with all the energy needed to withstand Russia's blackmail and ease pressures on Ukraine for an early and unsatisfactory negotiated settlement. Unfortunately, the Biden administration shows little sign of moving in this direction. It appears locked in the green policies promoted by environmental activists, coordinated with what I would describe as an international business banking syndicate, heavily represented in Biden's cabinet, whose stated goal is destroying the fossil fuel industry in order to safeguard massive startup investments in clean energy projects. To be sure, there are some signs of cracks in this racketeering scheme. JP Morgan chairman Dimon said in an interview last week that geopolitical and economic necessities now require the stimulation of fossil fuel production. Green policies would certainly be reversed if, as appears likely, a Republican administration replaces Biden in the next 2 years. Tragically, very tragically, this could all happen. This could all come too late to save Ukraine, or at least Ukraine's current territorial integrity. Go ahead, Christian.
Now, the President Zelensky of France requests support from Ukraine to end the war before the end of the year. This request is possible?
Yes, I mean the end of the year is very much bandied about as a time when negotiations might be expected to start and when a peace process might start going. Frankly, I think this has less to do with Ukraine's agenda, or with Macron's agenda, or with any political factors, than with simply the fact that December is winter, at which point the cutoff of Russian gas would start to really affect the lives of Europeans. Christian, the Russians are also beginning to expand their presence in Latin America. Nothing very dramatic until now, but there are indications from intelligence sources I've spoken with that we could soon see Russian troops, maybe in not very large quantities, perhaps a brigade-sized unit, maybe smaller, landing in Nicaragua. Okay, where there are already a number of advisors and technical personnel, managing or a lot of Russian hardware already there, tanks, gunboats, satellite stations, that kind of thing. And it's interesting, very disturbing, in fact, that there have been Russians have been linked, a Russian hacking group, all right, has been linked to cyber attacks in Costa Rica, which have been conducted over the past few weeks. I don't know if you're aware of this. There have been some pretty serious cyber attacks on the Costa Rican computer grid, which has been traced to a Russian hacking team. All right. Listen, it's possible. I mean, Russia could at least be, maybe they want the U.S. to believe they would support some Nicaraguan move on Costa Rica, something that Nicaraguans have long been threatening. They have several border issues with Costa Rica. I think they took some island off the Costa Rican coast, or maybe on a river, separating two countries a few years ago. And I think this is a clear message to the U.S. that Russia could be meddling along its neighborhood as a response to U.S. support for Ukraine and reinforcement of Eastern European of its forces along the borders with Russia. I think it's very likely that, especially Nicaragua, which I think Putin may be prepared to invest small of his military capabilities of his military in Latin American client states like Nicaragua and Venezuela to threaten the U.S. a little bit, make the U.S. uncomfortable. And of course, we've got to take something else into account, a new development. We have President Petro, a leftist former guerrilla leader. Well, member anyway. I don't think he had a leadership role in M19, but he was certainly a supporter and an operative of the group. Now elected president of Colombia. Now, let's not jump to conclusions. People change. He may now be a much more moderate leftist. We had an ex-guerrilla leader, was who became president of Uruguay. And he governed in a very reasonable way, and everything was all right. He was a one-time member of the Tupamaros. But we don't know. But I would definitely say that a noted leftward drift in Latin America at the moment might put the U.S. in a more exposed or in a more isolated position regionally if they were to require OAS support against Russian moves in the region. If they were to try to get an OAS resolution condemning, Russian movements or any Russian deployment in the area, like President Kennedy did during the Cuban Missile Crisis in 1962. You recall at the time, Kennedy got a unanimous vote at the OAS supporting the U.S. position against Russia's movement installation of missiles in Cuba. I frankly doubt, Christian, that the U.S. would count with such unanimous support in Latin America if it was to ask for a similar, in the OAS, if it were to ask for a similar resolution today. I really don't think it would happen. Unanimous, no way. 2/3, maybe. And now with every government going left, maybe not even that. Christian, what do you think?
That's the real reason. The new President Petro is maybe changed how Mujica, but in this position, he talked with the first president Venezuela, Maduro. He connection, real communication with Maduro. Last day of a president election. That's very interesting position of the Petro, Colombian president.
Yeah, no, I think the indications are that he's going to improve relations with Venezuela, which, if you recall, Venezuela and Colombia were almost at the state of near war under President Duque, who's still president, but that changes next month. And there's been this plan Gran Colombia.
Gran Colombia. Mm-hmm.
It's a project that Chavez floated. Remember, he often talk about it, of unifying
1999.
Venezuela, Colombia, and Ecuador. It was a project that Bolivar had. It was his project for the regional merging a South American power there in the northern part of South America. So this has been in the books for quite some time. In fact, when I was in Venezuela, it was interesting. You talk to grassroots activists of the Chavista movement, and they all talked about the Gran Colombia. Okay, it is it is a very embedded part of the whole Chavista ideology of the Movimiento Bolivariano, the political system, the political ideology that now dominates Venezuela, and I think will probably under Petro will take increasing influence in Colombia. Of course, was so that's the idea was that FARC was going to supposedly push Plan Colombia in Venezuela, but of course that this guerrilla movement became increasingly weakened by U.S.-supported Colombian counterinsurgency efforts, and although frankly the peace deal they signed with President Santos 4 years ago. Was it 4 years ago? Was quite favorable to the FARC and allowed them to enter the political system, which undoubtedly they will be very represented, undoubtedly in the new government. I wouldn't be surprised if members of FARC are not given positions in the government under Petro. Now, to go on another subject, I reported at some length last week about the detained Iranian flight in Argentina, or to put it more precisely, the flight of a Venezuelan airliner using an Iranian plane with Iranian pilots and passengers sequestered in Argentina under orders from the FBI, which basically applied U.S. sanctions to the plane. Because that particular plane was on the U.S. sanctions list. I said at the time that the plane was the tip of an iceberg of a much larger Iranian operation. And since then, I've been delving into what lies under the surface. The Boeing 747, which previously belonged to the sanctioned Iranian airline Mahan Air, before being registered with the newly formed Venezuelan cargo airline Emtrasur, forms part of a fleet of 7 such airliners, okay? That is airliners donated by Iran to Emtrasur that regularly fly between Latin American countries and Iran and other points in the Middle East, providing what the FBI refers to as logistical services for Iran's covert operations, all right? Stops apparently have also included Cuba and Libya. While the Emtrasur flight was grounded in Argentina last week, while it was grounded, while the process is taking place of its being grounded and inspected, another one of these airliners landed in Peru, all right? Another Emtrasur plane landed in Peru, and nothing was done. Apparently, was not on the sanctions list, but it was a plane associated with these flights. Joseph Humeyer, who is director of the Washington Center for a Secure and Free Society, whom I spoke to last week when I was in Washington, says that Emtrasur was created for the purpose of supporting Venezuelan Iranian military activities that increasingly involve joint industrial projects to assemble weapons in Venezuela, including Predator-type drones. Mr. Humeyer believes that the plane was traveling frequently to the Argentine industrial center of Cordoba, which is one of Latin America's largest concentrations of heavy industry in machinery, chemicals, plastics, all that kind of stuff, to pick up parts and components for Iranian industrial ventures in Venezuela, where, of course, imports of industrial goods is limited by U.S. sanctions. A former Argentine counterterrorism official who maintains close contact with Argentine intelligence agencies says that the flights also serve the purpose of moving Iranian personnel around Latin America and supplying arms and other material to Iranian cells and Hezbollah agent networks throughout the region, managed by officers of Iran's Special Operations Units, the Quds Force. According to my sources, the Argentine government is currently caught between what one official describes as enormous pressures from the part of Venezuela and Iran to release the aircraft, and equally strong pressures from the US and Israel for its confiscation. The Venezuelans and Iranians really want the aircraft. According to US State Department sources in Washington, the plane is very important to the growing Iranian-Venezuelan joint ventures, to the point that Iran's Mahan Air has sent another Boeing to Venezuela to replace the one detained in Argentina. They obviously need to keep up the frequency and volume of these flights. They're really working on something. One would expect that Iran may have at least taken the precaution to provide Venezuela an aircraft with clean record this time. Maybe they're supplying to Venezuela now, but you expect they'll have a clean record. It won't be on the U.S. sanctions list, and it can fly around without it being stopped. The one grounded in Argentina was on the U.S. sanctions list for flying arms to Hezbollah in Syria. All right, they had this license number under the U.S. sanctions list because it had flown several Iranian flights into supply flights into Syria to assist Hezbollah and the Assad regime. Iran responded last time. The tug of war over the grounded airliner could get violent and develop into a undercover direct action type warfare in Latin America between U.S. intelligence agencies and Israel's Mossad on the one side and Iran's Al-Quds force on the other, counting with local support of Venezuela as well as elements of other secret services that are aligned or influenced by Iran. The situation is developing very similar to the type of conflict that developed between Israel and Iran, leading to terrorist bombings of the Israeli embassy and the AMIA building in Buenos Aires during the 1990s. At the time, Israel was very involved with blocking the sale of Argentine missile technology to Iran. Right, the Israeli government, the Mossad, was taking a very important role in trying to do this. Iran responded by destroying Israel's main centers of operation in Argentina with truck bombings conducted by Hezbollah suicide drivers, directed by Quds officers operating undercover in the Iranian embassy, who have since been indicted. There's an Interpol arrest warrant out for them. An official investigation into possible collusion in the assault by elements of Argentina's secret services and alleged official cover-ups conducted under President Cristina Kirchner, who was president about 6 years ago, led to the assassination of Argentine prosecutor Alberto Nisman in 2015, in a clearly orchestrated hit job, which the Argentine government claims was a suicide. All right, the Argentine said he committed suicide, but all indications are that a hit team entered his apartment and killed him. Shot him in the back of the head. There seems to be something of an open season. For prosecutors in South America. A Paraguayan prosecutor was assassinated just last month in Colombia through a hit job in which Hezbollah and Venezuelan gunmen appear to have been involved. Right? The prosecutor, Marcelo Pecci, conducted the arrest and extradition to the U.S. some years ago with drug trafficker and money launderer involved with terrorist and criminal networks in Paraguay and in Latin America. it appears that this may have been a some sort of vendetta killing. And of course, killing someone who's acting very strongly for the U.S. law enforcement agencies in the region. I would add, Christian, as a final note, a curious development this week, in which an Iranian was stopped entering the Uruguayan border from Argentina. All right. He was carrying Argentine documentation, Argentine identity documents, which were illegal in the sense that they had been, they weren't forged. They had been, all indications were that they had been processed through they had undergone the normal issuing process, which is the way these documents are done right now. But I think they caught him because his identity card was different from his driver's license. Two separate Argentine documents. So they screwed up there, or maybe he screwed up. Maybe he just wasn't very smart. They traced this guy, and apparently they found that he entered South America from Iran on a flight to Venezuela some months ago. He moved from there to several South American countries and ended up in Argentina, where he acquired the latest false documentation with which he was trying to enter Uruguay. This is highly, highly suspicious. Coming at a time like now, it would appear that maybe he was being set up or being sent to Argentina to form part of maybe some terrorist team that would conduct some sort of attack in Uruguay. Which, let's bear in mind, Uruguay was the country that stopped this latest flight that was sequestered in Argentina, this Boeing 747, that this Emirates Iranian airliner that is now sequestered in Argentina. Uruguay denied it permission to refuel when it was on its way to Venezuela and it had to return to Argentina. So it's Uruguay's responsibility that this whole situation developed, right? They may well be planning some kind of attack in Uruguay as a way of getting back to Uruguay for having done this, for having exposed and interfered with the Iranian network of flights in Latin America. And this guy that caught entering Uruguay may have been part of it. The fact that they had screwed up on his identity documents, the fact that he maybe appears not to be very smart, does not necessarily make it appear innocent. Quite the contrary. I mean, you don't need to be a genius to be a suicide bomber. Okay, someone doesn't need to be a genius to allow quite the contrary. I think you need to be pretty retarded to allow someone to strap bombs on you, so you can blow yourself up, or to drive a truck laden with explosives into a building and blow everything like they did with Amia and the Israeli embassy in Buenos Aires. Anybody can do that, okay? Yeah. In fact, they need somebody who's a bit of a zombie, all right? That's exactly the type of person they need, all right? Yeah. So this man and the guy that they're man to do this. If anything like that was planned in Uruguay, it would seem that if they caught someone who can't even get his documents together to cross the border, that may just be the kind of person that they were sending to do something absolutely horrible in Uruguay.
Is it possible a strategic alliance between Hezbollah with the first command of capital, the Brazil, with weapons and drugs?
Well, that does seem to be developing. In fact, my friend Jim Humar is working on this in Washington. There do seem to be links. They are exchanging services. Explained to me that the PCC allows distribution, maybe for drugs that Hezbollah brings in, and Hezbollah provides money laundering and other services for the PCC to expand internationally that the PCC needs. Okay. And of course, the long-standing activity that the Hezbollah has in Paraguay merges very well with the extensive PCC activity in that area. The fact that it's a Brazilian-based group, which has all kinds of criminal ties in the triple border region. So that these two are cooperating would seem to be very, very logical.
Weapons, Iran weapons, Venezuela weapons.
That's another thing. Venezuela, Hezbollah can supply all kinds of weapons to the PCC. All kinds of weapons, any weapons they want.
It's very interesting, very interesting.
To consolidate their control, which they already have over large urban districts in Sao Paulo and other major Brazilian cities, and maybe expand beyond that. Maybe expand into other countries.
Is true the manufacture weapons AK-47 in Venezuela in this moment?
Yes.
Wow.
It's been going on for quite some time. I think the deal to set up a Russian automatic rifle factory in Venezuela was signed with Chavez a long time ago, back in the 2005, something like that. And it's not the AK-47, it's the latest model. It's the AK-103.
Wow.
Which is now the standard weapon of the Venezuelan armed forces. And of course, it's probably being supplied to Nicaragua and could be supplied to other armed groups throughout the Latin American region.
Sao Paulo, that's really connection with drugs and weapons. That's the real connection.
In fact, I think I mentioned in an earlier program that Venezuela tried to sell the Iranian version of the AK-47, a more compact version, to Uruguay.
Uruguay, yeah.
This is some time ago.
You had the list, Uruguay, I think so. Okay, that's the conclusion. That's the end of this podcast. Dear Martin.
Christian, thank you very much. As I say, keep watching. As I say, we're trying to enhance and expand our investigative reach, our investigative capabilities. We welcome sponsors. Anybody who might be interested in sponsoring our show, please get in touch. And as I say, we get under the news. We don't repeat what other media tell you. We're not here to join the chorus. We are here to tell you what's really going on based on facts that we dig up, facts that we consider important, that are maybe being ignored elsewhere, or overlooked elsewhere. And as we say, we don't dwell in conspiracies, but we don't deny that they exist. Thank you, Christian. And thank you to our audience.
See you again next podcast, and subscribe and share everything about international security, anti-corruption, anti-crime with Martin Arostegui. See you. Bye.
See you, Christian. Bye.